Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 108. Let me look at my notes here. With our book today, a story that represents what I think is the height of what a novelist trained in the space of anthropology and anthropological research and a master of deep linguistic understanding can do with her writing talent at the height of her power. This author, based in the culture of the post-Civil War and Jim Crow South, never once renounced her past or allowed her past to define the direction of her talent or the focus of her life, much to the dismay of many of her literary peers at the time. Her most famous quote from many famous quotes is as follows, quote, "Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me." And, quote, "But I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all." Close quote. Today, we will be feasting and focusing and talking about the ins and the outs of one of what I think is one of the most important novels by any female author of the early 20th century, including Virginia Woolf, Catherine Ann Porter, Pearl Buck, who we've all covered on this podcast, and of course, many others. 1937's Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Leaders, take a stand for principles, but also know where you came from. Of course, as usual, we will be joined in our conversation today by our regular co-host, Tom Libby. How you doing, Tom?
Every day's a good day, Hasan. I'm doing very well.
So Tom just came traversing back from a college graduation. That was both exciting and enlightening for him. So congratulations to his daughter for graduating college. By the way, what degree has she attained, if you don't mind us asking, or mind me asking?
She has she just got her bachelor's in psychology with a minor in Native American studies.
All right, psychology and Native American studies. Okay.
So in other words, she's going to be able to help out our family a lot because we need a lot of psychological help. And then she cheated on getting a minor because a minor in Native American studies was basically like, I mean, she could have done it with her eyes closed and walking backwards. It was not even a challenge. It was unfair. She had an unfair advantage.
She had an unfair advantage. Yeah. She was a ringer in that class.
Exactly.
So, all right. Well, no, but that'll be good. So, is she going to go into therapy, or is she going to just sort of stay in a research, or is she not decided yet?
So,
because there's several different paths.
There's a lot of it depends going on. I'll just put it that way, because she doesn't want to go into therapy from a standpoint of the way she words it. I really just cannot sit and listen to people complain about their lives for 8 hours a day. She goes, because half the time I'll just want to tell them words I can't say as a therapist.
Sure.
She goes, but that doesn't mean that I wouldn't look at therapy from like people who like really like. So we have a state mental hospital that is relatively close by our house that she thinks that she might want to at least start with, because people who are actually mentally ill and hospitalized due to mental illness. That is interesting to her, and try to help those people versus people just complaining about their day, complaining about their job, complaining about their wife or husband. She goes, that stuff is just not relevant enough for her to worry about. So she was thinking, and or to your point, to your statement a second ago, or research is really intriguing to her, but she knows if she goes into research that this bachelor's degree is not going to be worth anything. She has to go back and actually even a master's degree in research, in psychology research, even a master's degree is not really even worth anything. She has to go back for a PhD in order to do that. So there's a lot of it depends going on right now. I think she's just happy to be done with this part of it. And I think she's just going to want to go do something until she figures it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, congratulations to her. We've minted one more bachelor's degree holder in the United States of America. Yay for us. This is the time of year when we do mint them all, we do churn them all out. And look, one of the books they should be reading, whether they are graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology, or they are a mere humanities major like myself, or even if they, didn't go to college, right? Is Their Eyes Were Watching God. I was telling Tom before we hit the record button on this sucker for today that I probably should have read this book like 10 years ago. And I didn't read it because of my own personal biases and prejudices around reading different interpretations of Zora Neale Hurston's work, and quite frankly, her life and her artistic choices, without having the full context of the background of who she was, which we'll get into today on the podcast, and what she was seeking to accomplish with her work, which I think has relevance around, and this is why I said leaders have to have principles. I think has relevance around that position, or not position, that posture towards principles. And so where this ties into Tom's newly minted graduating daughter is that it's a good idea to figure out your principles before you go off and take a position on anything, and so I would recommend more of that for folks in general in our country today. So opening with Their Eyes Were Watching God. Now, this book was published initially, as I said, in 1937. Currently, the copyright, it was renewed in 1965. And the copyright is for this edition is owned by HarperCollins Publishers. And so we will not be reading directly from the book. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of do a Spark Notes overall summary. I'm going to point out some salient high points from the book. I'm going to encourage you to get it, go out and buy it, go out and read it. And then I'm going to make some comments, and Tom and I are going to have some discussion about what leaders can take from the work of Zora Neale Hurston. So the book opens with Janie, and we meet the character Janie with the line, and I think I can successfully or safely read this line. It is the first line of Their Eyes Are Watching God, and it does tie into what happens to her much later towards the end of the book. But it is an iconic line that opens up this novel. It says, "Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men." So we start off very soberly, and we meet Janie, and we meet her friends. We meet Phoebe Watson, but most importantly, we meet Janie's grandma. And Janie's grandmother is a very powerful character in this book, and she determines Janie's life, at least the first part of Janie's life, as she moves from being a child into being a young woman. And this is a huge transition for all women. I have a couple of daughters, and Tom was just talking about his daughter graduating. It's a huge transition, graduating from college. It's a huge transition to watch a young woman go from being, 10, 11, 12 years old, knock-kneed little girl to now you're 14, 15, 16. Now we're moving into that stage of womanhood. So we walk through that in the first couple of chapters, as well as the fact that Janie, who was raised by her grandma, is a light-skinned African-American woman living in West Florida. This is important because in the post-Civil War era, North Florida, West Florida, the area up near Jacksonville, and near southern Alabama and Georgia, that area, a lot of African Americans who had been enslaved moved down into that area of Florida and began to intermingle and intermix with some of the Seminole Indians. By the way, the Seminole Indians are referenced in this book. It's interesting when the hurricane comes through, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the African Americans in here, Zora puts, I think, what was dominant African American thought at that time about the Seminole Indians into their mouths, and has them speak about that. Janie's first marriage is to a man named Logan Killix, who is someone her grandma picked for her, because her grandma didn't basically want her to have children out of wedlock. That was really the key thing there, and wanted her to be a moral woman. And that relationship with her grandma, that relationship with Logan, becomes fraught with challenges and fraught with friction, particularly during the first year. As a matter of fact, the grandmother is so, how can I put this, so strong a force in Janie's life that in chapter 3 of Their Eyes Were Watching God, the grandmother, Nanny, basically prayed for their marriage. And as a result of her praying hard for their marriage, she had a stroke and died a month later. She prayed herself right into death. Janie's marriage to Logan Killix ends in chapter 4 when she meets a man named Joe Starks. And that begins a journey into Janie's second marriage and longest marriage in the book, and switches her or transitions her. And Zora Neale Hurston does a really excellent job of this, transitions her from being a dewy-eyed young woman who'd been married a year to a young woman who was really trying to figure out what love is, and what love actually means. That's the first 4 chapters of Their Eyes Were Watching God. A lot of interesting things happen in there. Now, one of the things you're going to notice when you read this book, and we're going to come back to this again and again and again, is the dialectical choices of the language and the dialogue in Their Eyes Are Watching God. So if you do pick this up, you will notice that most of the speech is broken. Most of the speech is broken English, what we would call these days broken English. My grandmother, I'm now remembering this now, I hadn't thought of this until just now. So when I was coming up, my grandmother lived in my house, right? We had a multi-generational household, and my grandmother's father was a sharecropper, one generation away from slavery. And my grandmother was one of like 12 kids, and started taking it in the wash when she was like 8. And she would object to me saying like here quite a bit. My grandmother raised me to speak in what is commonly known these days as a flat Midwestern vernacular. She wanted me to speak as if I could come from anywhere and go into anything. And if you don't have a video of me, or you haven't actually seen a picture of me online, you'd be able to listen to my voice and not tell if I was African American or Hispanic or white or what. And by the way, this has been a tool that I've used, not to give away the inner game a little bit, but I'll give you a little inside baseball. This is a tool I have used over the course of my life to flummox people, because very often when they have spoken to me on the phone and they have not met me and have not researched me online or don't have a video of me or never seen a picture, I speak like this. This is just how I talk. And we'll talk about the dialectical choices of Zora Neale Hurston here in a minute. But I've talked like this for years. It was pounded into me by my grandma, who said, and I quote, "There will be no dis here and dat dare in my house." So when you speak without dis here and dat dare, when you speak in a flat Midwestern dialect, well, it gets you into everything, in particular in business dealings. And so it's always been very interesting when I speak to people on the phone, like when I was first starting my business, first starting my consulting business way back in the day, I would talk to people on the phone, and then I would show up and the look of shock on their face would be unbelievable. But I say, yes, you called me on the phone.
It's not. I gotta say something to this
Yeah,
because
go ahead. Yeah.
I feel like it's really funny that as far away as we are from the thises and dats of that era, because if you think about it, it's not as predominant today, but it's still
No.
around, but it's not that predominant as it was back then. But the Boston accent, by the way, is living strong.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
I
yeah,
have
absolutely.
and I have a very similar reaction from people when they find out that I'm from the Boston area, because they go, "Oh, where did you live before that?" Because I don't have a very strong Boston accent. And don't get me wrong, it comes out every once in a while. Usually when I'm heightened of some sort of emotion, either overly upset, overly angry, really happy, whatever, anything that's exaggerated, you lose a little bit more of that self control of conversation. But for the most part, as I just said, like for the most part, I pronounce my R's, right? Like I try to speak very clearly. And people find out I'm from Boston. They go, "Oh, where are you from originally?" I go, "No, Boston. I'm born and raised here." It's just that I was so tired of people making fun of the Boston accent that I just didn't want to have one. So I made a very conscious effort to not do that. But yeah, I understand where your grandmother's coming from for sure.
Yeah. Well, she would, it's interesting the choices that Hurston made in and when you start reading it, the way my internal dialogue works, and this is, I think, for a lot of people, I don't think I'm unusual in this. We revert back to whatever our natural speech is in our internal dialogue. And so when we're reading something that's from a dialogue or a dialect or a linguistic style that is different, but yet is fundamentally English, we're now doing an interpretive dance in our head. So we're trying to interpret the words on the page. It's like reading a foreign language. We're trying to interpret the words on the page, reading them in the foreign language. And then I imagine foreign language speakers do this, or people who speak English, or native English speakers do this when they learn a second language and then try to read a book in that second language. You're converting what's in that book into your language, right? So that you can understand it. And we're doing the same thing with the dialects here. And Hurston really pushes that mode here in Their Eyes Are Watching God.
I was gonna use the second language as an example as well, because I think it goes one step further than that. Because if I hear like Spanish from Spain is very different than South America. So
Yes.
Sometimes I'll hear something from Spain and I have to interpret it into South American Spanish before I can interpret it to English.
Right.
Like so it's like so yeah, I was going to use the foreign language part as an example as well, but for me it's in addition to the, like, even the foreign languages have their own accents, and even some of the accent stuff I don't understand until I revert it back to something I understand, and then I revert it back to English to make sure I understand even like to that level. So yeah,
well,
it's very interesting.
Well, and when I was reading the book, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on today, but when I was reading the book, I was doing that code switching, and I'll talk about code switching here today as well. But I was doing that code switching in my head, and it was interesting how folklore and again the research that Hurston did into folklore, which I'll talk about her background here in a minute, but that she did into folklore, that she did into linguistics, that she did into dialects, the level of anthropological understanding that she had about what those modes actually meant, and then her ability to convert that into fiction in order to draw deeper meanings about life that are generalized to all people regardless of how they speak. That's the brilliance of this book.
Yeah,
that's the brilliance of this novel. Speaking of the author, so Zora Neale Hurston was born January 7th, 1891, and died January 28th, 1960. As I've said before, she was an American author. anthropologist, and also a documentary filmmaker. So she definitely got around. If she'd been born a couple of generations later, she probably would have gotten a MacArthur or a Guggenheim Award and never would have had to work for the rest of her life. Unfortunately, she was born when she was born, and so she struggled, not all of her life, but all of her career, to actually make a living off of her writing and off of her research. She was born in Notasulga, Alabama, in 1891. And then in 1894, she moved to Eatonville, Florida. Now, Eatonville is a very important character in Their Eyes Were Watching God, as it was a Black community that was designed by Black people in northern Florida that Hurston grew up in. Matter of fact, her father, I believe, if I remember correctly from my research, her father was either in the city government there or something like that. But she was quoted as saying, basically saying, and I'm going to paraphrase her quote, that she saw Black people operating competently regardless of how they talked in order to design the city, run the city, make sure the services ran in the city. And everybody had pride there. And the kind of pride that later on would be referenced in the 1960s and 1970s civil rights movement. But it was pride in a segregated all Black town where white people refused to live. And this is one of those dynamics that is not often talked about in American culture, where the pre-1950s and Richard Wright, and I'll talk about some of Hurston's literary battles with Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison. But I referenced a little bit of this bifurcation when I talked about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington with DeRollo Nixon on our episodes that we did where we covered Souls of Black Folk and Up from Slavery back in February. You might want to go back and listen to those episodes. But in the 1930s, there was a definitive bifurcation between academicians and civil rights activists and those kinds of folks, and then folks who were representing people who lived on the ground and actually had to go and farm and had to go and live, had to go and make a living and didn't have a whole lot of education and didn't have a whole lot of opportunity. And there was a bifurcation there that is still reflected in the African-American community today in America. But that bifurcation created Eatonville, and Eatonville came out of that as a result. Eatonville was a place where, working class African-Americans could build their own thing and be competent and be considered competent. And Hurston saw that up close and grew up with that as a child and as a young woman. In her early career, Hurston conducted anthropological and ethnographic research as a scholar at Barnard College and Columbia University. She had an interest in African-American and Caribbean folklore, including hoodoo, voodoo, witchcraft, conjuring, root work, kitschakoo, gree-gree, all of that. Anything that had to do with sort of nature worship, pagan worship, a combination of pagan worship and Roman Catholic worship, all of that kind of stuff. She was interested in all of that. And as a matter of fact, while she roundly rejected religion during her time, as a matter of fact, she said she didn't really believe in an all-loving God or a God of any kind. She did believe that there were demonic, I won't say demonic, there were other forces in the world. And she did participate in those rituals in order to, I think, understand the ethnography, understand the emotions behind the research. I think that was the primary reason she was engaged in that. And of course, how these practices in these spaces contributed overall to a community's identity. She also wrote about contemporary issues in the Black community in the 1930s and 1940s, and became a central figure of the Harlem Renaissance. So that's where she ran into Richard Wright. That's where she ran into Ralph Ellison. That's where she ran into the jazz singers and all those kinds of folks. She was a raconteur and a woman about town in Harlem. And whenever she would go out, and when she would walk into a room, she would announce herself quite individualistically. Hurston's work concerned both the African-American experience and her struggles also as an African-American woman, which is either a subset or a dominant part of the African American experience, depending upon who you ask. Now, her novels went relatively unrecognized by the literary world for decades, starting in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, and even the 1970s, for cultural and political reasons. As a matter of fact, in the 75th anniversary version of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I'm going to ask Tom here a question in just a minute, the afterword is written by Henry Louis Gates Jr. He's the person, if you're not aware, who does DNA tests on African Americans, and then they find out how much all of us here are interrelated to each other in all of our genetics. He does this on PBS. If you have not ever seen this show, I mean, it's not just African Americans that he does this research with. It's also white folks and Asian folks, because we're all a multicultural mix here. One of the points that he makes here in the afterword is this one, and I quote: Hurston's achievement in Dust Tracks is twofold. Dust Tracks is one of her books. First, she gives us a writer's life rather than an account, as she says, of quote unquote the Negro problem. So many events in this text are figured in terms of Hurston's growing awareness and mastery of books and language and linguistic rituals as spoken and written by both by masters of the Western tradition and by ordinary members of the Black community. These two speech communities, as it were, are Hurston's greatest sources of inspiration, not only in her novels, but also in her autobiography. The representation of her sources of language seems to be her principal concern, as she constantly shifts back and forth between her literate narrator's voice and a highly idiomatic Black voice found in wonderful passages of free indirect discourse. Hurston moves in and out of these distinct voices effortlessly, seamlessly, just as she does in Their Eyes Were Watching God, to chart Janie's coming to consciousness. It is this use of a divided voice, a double voice, unrecognized and unreconciled, that strikes me as her greatest achievement, a verbal analog of her double experiences as a woman in a male-dominated world and as a Black person in a non-Black world, a woman writer's revision of W.E.B. Du Bois's metaphor of quote-unquote double consciousness for the hyphenated African American. Close quote. However, during the time that she was actually writing and alive, Henry Louis Gates is writing this afterward many, many years after her death. By the way, she was buried in an unmarked grave that Alice Walker had to find in the 1970s after having died in an old folks' home unrecognized in the 1960s. She was criticized, Hurston was, for her use of this double consciousness and this double voice, and for actually publishing this out loud, and for her anthropological and linguistic references by writers like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison during her time. And she got into literary battles with these guys because she wasn't going to back down to nobody, if I may be so bold. And so that's Zora Neale Hurston. That's a little bit about her. I would encourage you to go look at her just as a character in her own right. But to get Tom in a little bit more here, I know you didn't. You've been very busy doing a lot of things, graduations, traveling. You recently were in the Dominican Republic. Came back, not tanned or fit, but I mean, you came back.
I came back in one piece. That was enough for me.
You came back in one piece. right. So, and I know that you had mentioned that when you looked at this, you were like, "Oh my gosh, I should have read this." But what are some of your thoughts after sort of I laid out some of these ideas from Their Eyes Are Watching God and Zora Neale Hurston? What are some of your initial thoughts?
Well, I think the first thing that pops into my mind is something that you said. I think of it a little differently, but you said something as you were talking earlier, and you said something about the fact that had she been born today, this would have been a very different world for her because she would have never had to work. She would have made a lot more money, and I agree with all that. In that
she would have gotten a Guggenheim or a Guggenheim Fellowship or a MacArthur grant. Somebody would have given her money. Yeah,
somebody would have. You're right. So what I would say to that too is like, not only did I think she was before her time in a lot of respects of how she handled herself, the way she presented herself, the way she, came across, but I love the idea of the writing coming from an anthropological standpoint. Like she wasn't afraid to do the research and just show it. And you and I were talking about this before we hit the record button. It was refreshing to me that it was just so matter of fact and not coming from a place of sorrow or pain or look at what, I don't mean that this, please don't take any disrespect to this, but like she never had this feeling or thing that somebody or anybody owed her anything. It was like, I am who I am. We lived through what we lived through. I'm going to write this the way it's supposed to be written, and I'm just going to move forward. And I love that about her. I just thought that was incredible when I was doing some of the stuff, and I was like, this is how you're always asked that question about like, oh, if you can go back in history and meet anybody you want, who would it be, blah, blah, blah. And everybody says like the obvious, right? Like pick a point in history, whether you pick, FDR or Abraham Lincoln or Booker T. Washington or Benjamin Franklin, keep going back in time, Julius Caesar, and pick whoever you want. I'm really thinking that this should be the one for me, for me anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, because she just reminds me of somebody that is just so genuine, somebody that you could talk to about anything. And that if she is going to have an opinion about something, it's going to be based on, it's not just simply based on a thought. It's based on science for her. Like, and for those of you who are not aware, anthropology is a science. So I just want to make sure.
Yes, it is. It is.
Some archaeologists beg to differ. So I just wanted to make sure that is clear. But anyway, like, so I thought it was fascinating. She reminded me and what, like, because I read a couple of synopses, a little brief history of her. I didn't read the full book here, but I did read a quick synopsis of the book because I wanted to at least understand what the book was getting at before I come on the podcast. But she just presented herself as I think something else that you said I thought was interesting, where Gates Jr. was talking about how, she was a woman in a male-dominated world. She was Black in a non-Black dominated environment. But she was also a woman writer that spoke her mind and her truth in a time when a lot of writers in general, not even just women writers, but writers in general, were being pressured or coerced or whatever into writing certain styles or certain, like, you had to fall into certain categories. And like, there was all this kind of weird, I don't want to, maybe not weird, and it certainly wasn't weird at the time. People kind of felt it was normal. But she was just like, to heck with all that. I'm just going to be me. She would have fit in perfectly well with today's Gen Zs, right? Like,
oh yeah, oh yeah.
you do you, and I do me, and we're going to be happy. And if you're not happy with me, you go work over there, and I'll go work over here. Like that's
well. Gates talks about it also in the afterwards. So let me give a long quote here because it backs up exactly what you're saying, right? He says, "It is," and I quote from Henry Louis Gates from the afterword, from Their Eyes Are Watching God. "It is clear, however, that the loving, diverse, and enthusiastic responses that Hurston's work engenders today were not shared by several of her influential Black male contemporaries. The reasons for this are complex and stem largely from what we might think of as their," I love this, racial, quote unquote, racial ideologies. That's how he just decides to frame it.
I like the way he frames that because he put that more eloquently than I just did. But yes.
He did. He's a good. He knows how to use the words. He's good. He's good with that. Part of Hurston's received heritage and perhaps the paramount received notion that links the novel of manners in the Harlem Renaissance, the social realism of the 30s, and the cultural nationalism of the Black arts movement was the idea that racism had reduced Black people to mere ciphers, to beings who only react to an omnipresent racial oppression, whose culture is, quote unquote, deprived where different, and whose psyches are in the main, quote unquote, pathological. Albert Murray, the writer and social critic, calls this the, quote unquote, social science fiction monster. Socialists, separatists, and civil rights advocates alike have been devoured by this beast. This is Gates writing this. And I go further. Hurston thought this idea degrading, its propagation a trap, and railed against it. It was, she said, upheld by, quote, I love this quote, the sobbing school of Negrohood who hold that nature somehow has given them a dirty deal, close quote.
I just want this woman to be alive today. Honest to God. I really, like, can we bring her back? Like,
unlike Hughes and Wright, back to Gates for just a second, Hurston chose deliberately to ignore this quote-unquote false picture that distorted freedom. She wrote in Moses, Man of the Mountain, quote, was something internal. The man himself, remember I said she was an individualist? The man himself was make his own emancipation. And she declared her first novel and manifesto against the quote-unquote arrogance of whites, assuming that, quote, Black lives are only defensive reactions to white actions, close quote. And then Gates closes with this line, her strategy was not calculated to please.
Mm.
The woman was a puncher. She punched left and right. And we put it there in political terms in a post 1960s, post 20th century kind of environment, because that's the only context we know. She was thinking of it, I think, in a much broader contextual kind of way. I think of that song. What was the name of that band? Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right.
Oh, right. Here I am, stuck in the middle.
Stuck in the middle with you. Right. That was her. That would have been her theme song. Like, I got these idiots and I got these clowns, and neither of you can see reality. And what are we actually doing here?
Well, so I think it goes one step even beyond that, because I agree with you. Like, I love the idea that she was like, I'll punch to the left, punch to the right. But she also was like, I'm going to punch white, punch black, punch red, punch yellow. Like, she did.
Oh, yeah.
It was like that. That's kind of what I'm saying when I said that, like, I love the fact that she was writing from a standpoint of just matter of fact, right? Like, it was just,
right.
It is like, people, it is what it is. Like, we can't run from it. We can't hide from it. It is what it is. Can we just talk about it or write about it? Or, like, you just go play in your own sandbox. Like,
right.
Like,
exactly. Right? Well, she represents, all of the different stratifications, or as many of the different stratifications in Their Eyes Were Watching God, as she could, that she had direct contact with, right? So there's a white doctor in Their Eyes Were Watching God that diagnoses tea cake, who we'll meet later on, but who diagnoses tea cake with a disease that fundamentally leads to him being taken out of the narrative. So there's a white doctor in there. There are people there, there's stratifications even among the working class and lower class and poor Black people. There are stratifications even there. One thing that I've often pointed out to folks, and I've done my fair share of social justice work and bias training. And one of the things that I always point out to folks in those trainings, and usually most of those folks are middle class folks, is people in the lower classes, people who are working class, they have their own culture that deserves to be respected. You may not like it. It's not a culture you would pick. You're middle class. You've picked your own culture. You're upper class. You picked your own culture. That's fine, right? But there is a, for want of a better term, I'm going to use the Marxist term, there is a class conscience among people who are poor, for want of a better term. Are we not to respect that? Not to say that we are not raising people up, but are we not to respect that? Because you can't really raise up somebody who you don't respect. You look at them through a lens of pity or grievance, which was the word you were looking for earlier, but you probably didn't want to say. I'll say it. Victimhood, which is another word we're kind of dancing around, but I'll say it. If you're looking at people through those lenses, how are you going to treat them as individuals? How are you actually going to help them emancipate themselves? And I don't know how you can do that without seeing people as human beings.
I'll gladly use those words when we talk about a native book. How's that?
Okay. All right. That's fine. That's fine. Whenever we can, we're going to cover, I think it's, we're going to cover Empire of the Summer Moon later on this year. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah. But I mean,
I try not to use that type of stuff when I'm talking about a group of any group, not just racially, but just in a group of people that I haven't walked a mile in their shoes. So
right.
Something something from the outside looking in, they were like, oh my God, they're acting so victimized. To them, that might not be what they're trying to portray. It's just an interpretation of what I'm seeing or hearing. And so I don't like to classify things like that. But again,
well, and Hurston was Yeah. Well, and Hurston was inside of that group, and Hurston wasn't
Of
allowing
course.
anybody to get away with anything. She's like, no, I'm not going to let you get away with anything. Like
Right.
this is this is what is real here. This is the emotive nature of all of this, and this is why her work is, I think, not I think, this is why her work is, particularly Their Eyes Are Watching God. I think her work is going to be read for multiple generations throughout the rest of this century, because there's a universalism that she has hit on and that her writing hits on that is relatable to everybody, regardless of their station or their melanin level in their skin. And that is how you define a classic, when it's relatable to everybody, when everyone, regardless of station, can get something out of it. Okay, now you got something there. Now you're on the mountain. And I think Their Eyes Are Watching God, and I would suspect all the rest of the books in her portfolio, and along with her ethnographic research, her anthropological considerations, her ability to handle linguistic detail. Like she wrote this book in like 6 weeks.
Oh, Jesus.
Like it's insane.
That is totally insane.
Like it just because it just poured out of her, because she just had it. It just poured out.
I wonder how quickly. So she not only lived it but observed it, right? So
Yep.
she observed it and lived it and then studied on it.
Yep.
I was thinking in my brain, I was trying to compare her to Pearl Buck a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but I also recognize that there's a distinct difference where Pearl Buck wasn't of the race that she was
Right.
writing about, even though she did actually live it. She lived it, experienced it, and that was the same. But there was a stark difference to me,
Mm-hmm.
and even the styles. So like when I was looking
Yeah.
at the two, I was like, okay, because I respected Pearl Buck quite a bit too. But again, when I go back to Hurston, I was like, Pearl Buck would be kind of cool. I think that would be not, but first I want to meet her. I'm so sad that she's gone. Like I just really I would love to meet her. She reminds me of my grandmother, like because my
Yeah.
grandmother, similar situation. Like I'd come home from school and I'd be like, oh, I called my grandmother Gigi. I'd be like, oh, Gigi, like we were talking in U.S. history today about natives, and I brought up that I was native, and everybody laughed. And like, because for those of you watching the video, you'll see the color of my skin, and that
Mm-hmm.
you'll understand where I'm coming from. Um, and she would always say stuff like, "Well, that's their problem, not yours." Like she would always give me like, "So
Yeah.
why are you making that your problem? Like that's their problem, not yours." And if you internalize it, then you start. Again, I won't go into the whole
Mm-hmm.
details of it, but the conversations I have with her feel like it would be very similar to with Hurston.
So with
Like,
Hurston, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
like,
yeah. Well, and Hurston was not. Sometimes you're too early. Like we know this as entrepreneurs, people who build businesses,
oh yeah,
been involved in projects. Sometimes you're just too early to the game, and you can't help it. You have this thing that's got to come out of you, and you do get a sense. I've had this sense on projects that I've worked on where I've been too early, where just I was ahead of the market, whoever the market or whatever the market was. You get that sense at a certain point in the project that maybe this isn't going to quite land, but you're so committed to doing it. You're like, screw it. I don't care if it doesn't
yeah,
land right now. Like you have that moment where you're like, where you think, I don't want to conform to my environment. My environment's going to conform to me. And now you're Jack Nicholson in The Departed. You're killing people, and you're like, whatever.
we're
Like it's,
here now.
we're here now. we're here exactly. We're here now. You're having Matt Damon infiltrate the Boston Police Department. But she was early, I think,
Well,
and she
yeah, of
couldn't help
course.
it. But she had this thing in her. She had to get it out. And at the time, and Gates is correct, 30s social realism from, I mentioned Catherine Ann Porter, the writer of Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Catherine Ann Porter was writing in the 1930s in the social realism space. And she went and met, Diego Rivera. Frida Kahlo was operating during that period of time. There was a sense in the West that communism was working, socialism was the next step up from capitalism, we could get to that utopian paradise. Walter Lippmann was writing in the New York Times, just to sort of put some historical context around this. Walter Lippmann was writing in the New York Times about the greatness of Stalin's 5-year plan and how awesome everything was when he went to Moscow and how everybody looked happy. And there were no gulags. And that was actually, he didn't even mention that word because they never saw it on the tour. You know, it wasn't. And by the way, this was the golden era before World War II really kicked off, you know. Yeah, there was some rumblings about some wackadoo named Hitler in Germany, but like that was a European problem. So the 1930s were this weird sort of golden era of like social realism in the arts and this idea that you could ascend from capitalism to communism and achieve utopia because it had already happened in the Soviet Union. So that was the United States was right there. And then the rest of the West was right there. And Hurston looked at all that, I suspect, and went, no. And then just sort of said, I'm going to do my thing over here, and sort of walked away this way. And that's why I say she was early, you know, because the things that we would find out much later around all of those areas, political and cultural, kind of put paid to all of that for the rest of the 20th century. So I can forgive those people. And I've said this on the podcast before. I can forgive people for having the idea that communism was going to be the next great thing up until about 1940, maybe. But then anybody born after 1940, come on, what are we doing? Like, stop it. Stop with the Marxist rhetoric. Come on, we know where that leads to. Quit. We have the receipts, as the kids say these days. You know, we will look at the tail of the tape, as I said during my time. Okay. Of course, we're a leadership podcast, and I want to turn the corner here because we have a limited amount of time. I have a limited amount of time today, unless I'm going to do a two-parter on this, which we may very well do a two-parter. We'll see how far we get. But what can leaders, you think, just from your initial thought, like what can leaders potentially take from Hurston's writings? Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show.
So
I know it's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So because I think there's a lot there. I think there's a lot there to unpack too, right? Like,
right.
So and some of it goes to what you were talking about with the entrepreneurial situation, but some of it doesn't. Like, I think there's something to be said about knowing and understanding the pulse of your business, how the pulse of your business interacts with the rest of the stakeholders, whether it be the community that it sits in, the customers, the employees, and so on and so forth. And being able to look at somebody, and I have this moral principle that I'm going to leverage with my company and not waver from it based on the impact of those other stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes the impact of the stakeholders can be very strong, especially in today's cancel culture. Are you kidding?
Right.
Like, we've seen giant organizations almost get obliterated by the way that cancel culture just like gets blasted through social media. You could be
Mm-hmm.
on the top of the world one day, have one comment quoted or misquoted or whatever, and all of a sudden vilified, and now all of a sudden your stocks are tanking and all this other stuff, and you have to react to that.
Right.
So I think one of the lessons that she could probably I was actually going to ask you, I was going to flip this on you a little bit and ask you what kind of consultant would she be if she were our age today? And I think it would be, we don't have to answer that right now. That could actually be a podcast all by
That's
itself.
a podcast all by itself. Wow. Okay.
I'd love to see.
Yeah.
I'd love to see Hurston as a DEI consultant in today's world. If she was like 45, 50, I think. Anyway, we can talk about that later. But anyway, go back to what I do think that if you read this and you understand her and you understand her life and the style of her writing and where she's coming from and how what impacted her. Again, it wasn't just her community, but science impacted her. But it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't just science. It was also spiritual and
Mm-hmm.
religion, and there was a lot of impacts to her. But she had this principle about her
Right.
that was unwavering. And I think if you as a leader, if now that being said, I'm not suggesting that you don't challenge your own principle to make sure that it is a true north guiding light for you, but as long as you feel comfortable and confident that and you've had it tested and you've succeeded with that test, then she teaches you to follow that north star, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
she teaches you to not waver based on other people's opinions. Like, and we've seen people do that, right? We've
Oh
seen the
yeah.
battles between the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos of the world, and like those kinds of mega power people. And then you got Warren Buffett going, "You guys do what you're going to do. I'm just going to be over here being rich."
Right.
Like,
Yeah. I'm going to invest in DQ in the 1980s and be fine. It's fine. You
exactly.
guys have fun doing
I'm not going
whatever.
to care. You guys can have all the technology you want. I'm still going to make a crap load of money without ever like he just
On
didn't
ice cream.
right because he had his principle like and it was like he just went forward. I think that leaders can take something from that, and I think she was that kind of writer. I think if
Right.
we look at if we learn anything from her, it is not to allow other people or outside influences waver your own principles and moral guidance, as long as, like I said, I mean, you don't want to be driving down the wrong way on a one-way street.
Right.
Let's just put it that way, right? So
Yeah.
let's just make sure that you're validating your North Star, so to speak. But once you can validate it and you know that it's right and it's right for you, it's right for the people that are important to you, then go and don't let these other people worry about what you're saying. I don't know the show very well, but we were just talking about that same principle with Larry
Oh yeah.
David
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah. With
how
Curb Your Enthusiasm. Yeah.
he's been speaking his truth for 40 years and he's never been canceled for it.
Never.
Okay.
Never. Larry will
It's
never, it will never happen because, well, number one, his show is over right now. But number two, I haven't seen the last season of Curb, so don't ruin it for me, people who are listening. I'll see it later. But apparently there's a scene where he like leans over to some kid in like a baby carriage or something. And he's like, I'm 76 years old. I've never learned anything.
yeah, exactly.
And
Right.
he just walks away. And I'm like, yes, that's a principle. Now, it might be a
Right.
principle you don't agree with. I personally think, well, it's funny, but I don't know if that's a principle I would want to live by. But
Right.
we have a principle of freedom that allows us enough space in this country to have all those multivariant sort of ways of approaching this hard, complicated thing called life, and to figure out what our principles are. And then as leaders, look, I'm a big fan of principled leadership, but I'm not a big fan of leadership that says it's principled or tries to put its waffly, wavery positions underneath a thin sheen of principle. I'm not a fan
Yeah.
of that.
Not
Less
only
of
am I with
that.
you, not only am I with you on that from a leadership, even from a parenting perspective, like I never, ever, ever once said to my kids, well, do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah.
Like, don't do that because I said so, not because it's the right thing to do. Just do it because I
Right.
said so. I never wanted that. I wanted my kids to be in any company that I've ever worked for. It's okay to challenge me. I'm not going to back down from my principle. It's
Mm-hmm.
okay to challenge me, but at the end, you are eventually going to do what I want you to do, but I want you to understand why. I want you to
Right.
understand why it's important to move forward. I want you to understand whether you think it's the right decision or not. It still follows, again, I just keep using the phrase North Star. It follows our North Star. It follows in line with our North Star. So we're just that's why we're doing this.
Right.
If we go with your suggestion, or if we go with it your way, we have to change our North Star. And in order to change our North Star, we have to go through a whole big process. That's
Mm-hmm.
changing principles, it's changing the whole dynamics of the company or what have you. And if that's something you want to do, that's okay, but you have to change the North Star before you start playing around with the other
The other stuff.
suggestions and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, to your point though, like I've never bought into that. I'd never like even the leaders in companies that are like, yeah, just go do this because I think it's a good idea and go do that. Well, no, if it doesn't follow the principles of the company, then why am I doing it? But
Right.
I want people that work for me to do that for me.
Yeah.
Notice I said do that for me, not to me.
Not to you. I did
No,
notice
because
that.
there's a distinct difference there, right? There's a distinct
Yeah.
difference. When you do something to me, it's challenging, it's combative, it's unproductive. When you do something to me, I have to defend myself. When you do something for me, I have to justify my thought process. And in doing so, I can make sure that everybody does and flows the same way and kind of goes with it. So it's a big difference between doing something to you and for you.
So it's interesting that you bring up that difference, because if we go back to the book, Janie is about to meet a gentleman named Joe Starks. So in chapters 5 through 9 of Their Eyes Were Watching God, we begin the journey in Janie's marriage to Joe Starks. Um, When Joe meets her, he basically takes her away from her first husband. They don't get a divorce in sort of the formalized way that we do divorces now. He literally walks in, flashes, well, not even flashes a bunch of money. He tells her a bunch of stories. And then she's accused, because she believes these stories, by her husband, Logan, her first husband, of thinking that she's white because of the way that she acts. Oh, I'm gonna get into that a little bit here in a minute. But let me stay focused on the book for just a moment, because that's an important distinction that I want to bring up, because there are some interesting dynamics there that is revealed by that I know about, being an African American, that maybe another reader from another ethnic group wouldn't understand it. So I did laugh through that, actually, myself.
You just gave away your voice secret that you said
I did.
earlier in the show. Earlier in this episode, you said you weren't going to do, but you just did it. Anyway, go ahead.
I know, it's fine. It's whatever. It's fine. It's fine. I think the secret's probably out these days, so
Yeah,
it's fine. Besides, AI is going to take off my voice and go do a whole bunch of other different things with it, so whatever. So she meets a man named Joe Starks, who takes her off on a train, and he takes her to a place where he can begin to be a boss man, as we would say these days. He begin to be somebody in charge. He takes her to a place that is developing in Florida called Eatonville. Now, at the time when he runs across it, Eatonville isn't anything. It's a couple of different little streets that are rubbed out of dirt, and you've got a bunch of people sitting around, just basically BSing and sitting on the front porch, not really sitting on the front porch of a store, not really doing anything. And Joe Starks comes in. He buys 200 acres, and he begins to set himself up as a power broker in the town. As a matter of fact, he's such a good power broker in chapters 5 through 9 that he is declared, not elected, declared mayor of the town, which is a nice little turn of Zora Neale Hurston's thoughts on political power in the United States. As Joe stays in the town begins to grow. They get a light which is dedicated in a very hilarious fashion by Joe. And as he begins to expand his power, Janie begins to understand what being an entrepreneur and a store owner really means, and she begins to behave entrepreneurially. This is a woman who is portrayed initially in the first chapters of the book as having no more than maybe a third or fourth grade education. And yet Joe Starks puts her in charge of the store and sets her up in that space and lets her manage this. Well, not even empowers. That's not really the word. Complies her, and I'm using those words in that order for a particular reason, complies her to manage the store. And the store becomes the center of the town. And as the town grows and becomes more prosperous, so does Joe Starks. Until eventually, Janie begins to realize, and this is the journey, that the inside state of her marriage and the outside state of her marriage were two different things. So the BSers on the front porch of the store who could toss dice and talk the dozens, they saw her in one sort of way. Joe saw her in another sort of way. Matter of fact, there's a telling incident that occurs. I believe it's in chapter 6, late in chapter 6, early in chapter 7, where she's basically told to shut up and go back inside the store because she has position in the town now. Joe tells her that you're the mayor's wife. Your job is to merely stand there and look nice and manage the store. And as the inside state of her marriage and the outside state of her marriage begin to separate, and by the way, this is what I think Alice Walker and other post-1960s and 1970s feminist writers got from Zora Neale Hurston, was her separation in herself as a woman from Joe Starks as a man, regardless of race. This is where this sort of really begins to happen in chapters 5 through 9, until eventually Joe Starks, he gets sick, and I won't get into why he got sick, but he gets sick, and as he does, and this is on page this is on late in chapter 8, in Their Eyes Are Watching God. As he gets more sick, he begins to become more violent and abusive towards Janie. And there's a scene that occurs, and they're basically yelling at each other. And this is noted by Hurston, and I quote, "Times and scenes like that put Janie into thinking about the inside state of her marriage. Time came when she fought back with her tongue as best she could, but it didn't do her any good. It just made Joe do more. He wanted her submission, and he kept on fighting until he felt he had it. So gradually she pressed her teeth together and learned to hush. The spirit of the marriage left the bedroom and took to living in the parlor." That is a hell of a line, by the way. "It was there to shake hands whenever company came to visit, but it never went back inside the bedroom again. So she put something in there to represent the spirit, like a Virgin Mary image in a church. The bed was no longer a daisy field for her and Joe to play in. It was a place where she went and laid down when she was sleepy and tired." Close quote. Joe dies, of course, because in novels written by women, men die. And they die early and often. So he dies. And this allows her, such as it were, like a flower, to begin to bloom into her late 40s, or not late 40s, I'm sorry, early 40s as a widow. And that's sort of where chapter 9 really trends downward, and we get into the back third of the book. A lot of different things going on in the middle parts of that with the Joe Starks marriage. We already talked about Zora Neale Hurston writing in the dialects of the people that she led. One point that we didn't, or that she lived around and that she researched and that she studied. One of the things that we didn't talk about, and I think it's important to bring this up, and I kind of obliquely referred to it when I talked about how I talk, is that we have in our brains, whether we like it or not, and linguists like John McWhorter talk about this, and other linguistic researchers talk about this. He's a professor at Columbia University. He co-hosts a podcast with Glenn Lowry another Black intellectual economics researcher, and I occasionally will listen to that podcast, the Glenn Lowry Show. He's got a new book out, by the way. This is not an ad for him. Just go read his book, Confessions. I think it's Confessions of a Black Conservative, I think is what it's called, or something like that. Anyway, McWhorter, as a linguist, points this out in Hurston's work. And he points it out as a larger trend that we actually see in not only American culture, but worldwide culture, where language is changed for cultural or folk reasons. The dominant dialect tends to look upon the minority dialect, and this is in all cultures, as being less than. And the speakers of that minority dialect as having less than in an intellectual capacity. And we don't like to talk about this in America because it seems vaguely prejudicial or somewhat biased, but it is true. Just because it seems prejudicial or biased doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it makes us uncomfortable. And this is part of the reason, I think, why my grandma, and probably your grandma too, Tom, were very much consumed with, at least my grandma was, consumed with the idea of language as a proxy for intellectual capacity, or even worse, whether we like it or not, language as a proxy for intellectual competence. And we get really caught on that hook. And even today, we have issues and challenges with, particularly in Black America. I mean, I remember a few years ago, might have been 15 years ago now, there was all this talk about Black English, that we should be teaching this to kids in school, or we should, right, or rappers. You see this with rap music. But something weird happened about 15 years ago, maybe 10, where we stopped talking about this. And I think it's because Kanye West sort of went off the rails a little bit. But rap music has sort of shifted around, and they were the more popular purveyors of this sort of idea of a particular linguistic flavor that wasn't tied to intellectual capacity, but was instead tied to entertainment. Competency and language have to be teased apart by leaders, I think. And this is actually one of the challenges, and I think this is the core challenge that DEI is trying to solve. It's this idea that we have in our heads, which is deeply embedded. I think McWhorter would say that into almost our biology, that anyone who talks different must be different all the way down. It's not just, oh, they talk a little bit of a different dialect, but they have the same intellectual capacity and competency as me, so I should just trust them. I think that we fight against our biology and our psychology in that all the time. And I don't know how to solve that problem. I don't think a DEI program solves that problem.
I also think there's something to be said about the way that we categorize or classify some of this stuff too, right? Like, so for example, like somebody like you two people from the exact same family, right? Could be like, well, he's really book smart, but he's street smart.
Right.
And then, so we say it's almost like that pat on the head, right? Like that's his participation trophy. That, you know, he may not be book smart, but he's street smart. If I'm stuck in the middle of nowhere, I would rather be with this family member than that one, but if I'm at a cocktail party, I want that family member with me because it's going to make me look better. It's going to make me feel better. It's going to make me think I'm smarter or whatever. I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff too that kind of has a little bit of play in this. What I think we neglect to think about, and go back to the DEI thing in leadership today, and that whole idea, to your point, about somebody who speaks differently has to think differently, and if they think differently, then they may or may not fit. And what we sometimes forget to think about is sometimes those differences give us advantages, because they may not be looking at the problem the same way we are, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, so, and again, I don't know if this is a DEI thing or not. I don't really know that, but I often find myself thinking that intellect does not happen at school all the time.
Right.
Intellect can be somebody who goes out and learns on their own, somebody who goes out and figures something out, somebody can be a problem solver without having a PhD. Like, they don't need a PhD. They don't need to speak the way we speak in order to be a real problem solver. I believe, I forget who, I think it was Steve Jobs once said, if I want the easiest way to do something, I find the laziest person in the room and ask him to find a way to do it, right? Like, it's because the laziest person in the room is probably going to find the simplest way to do something because they don't want to do the work. They're lazy.
Right.
They're inherently lazy. That doesn't make them unintelligent. That doesn't make them
Right.
you know
Well,
I mean? Like,
it's this link to it's the part of it is the Protestant work ethic. So look, we try to talk around this and not directly address it. And the fact of the matter is, whether we are happy with it or not, our emotions don't factor in. The people that came to this country from Europe had a very specific worldview.
Mm.
And their worldview was based on Protestantism. And specifically, German Lutheran Protestantism, tied to the idea that you work along with getting the grace of Jesus to get into heaven and improve the world. We don't like that in our postmodern era. That makes us uncomfortable and weird. But that's such a strong idea that in America, now I can't speak for other countries, obviously, Canada is different. Mexico was different with the Spanish. Canada's different with the French, and then other countries, forget it. Like, I can't speak to any of that. But in America, that idea is so strong that it impacts how we think, regardless of book smarts, street smarts, race, class, whatever. It impacts how we think of what people produce as far as work. Because Joe Stark's, one of the fascinating things about Joe Stark's in Their Eyes Were Watching God, he goes off and buys 200 acres to expand the town of Eatonville, and he's a competent mayor. He knows his crap. He's an incompetent husband. He doesn't know how to lead his wife, but he knows how to be a politician. And by the way, it's never really clear where his money comes from. That's the other thing. You talk about being lazy. It's not clear where his money comes from. And Zora Neale Hurston isn't saying he gets his money illegally, but he literally just shows up to Janie's
with money.
with money. And like, it's never explained. And she doesn't ask. She's just so excited that he showed up with money because she's like a 17, 18-year-old girl.
Yeah.
And over the course of 12 years, she doesn't ask. It's not in the book. She doesn't ask, where'd you get your money from? She doesn't ask that question. She just observes how he uses his power, how he uses his competency to get power, and then how that power gets him more competency. She observes that vicious cycle. In America, because of how everything else is layered on top of the Protestant work ethic, we have a real hard time teasing apart all that.
Mm.
I think because we have such a hard time teasing apart, because not bowling ball. I think of it like a ball on a billiard table. That billiard ball hits a bunch of other different balls.
Yeah.
And cause and effect for us doesn't, just as human beings, just in general, doesn't. We struggle with cause and effect.
Yeah. I think part of it too is I think we are also, we're having less and less children, which gives us less and less exposure in a very private setting to different personalities.
Right.
Like I said, I mean, I have 5 kids. All 5 of my kids are very different.
Oh yeah, I got 4. Yeah, yeah.
And I think parenting also gives us a much more clearer indication of how we can have the same rules for everybody, but treat people as individuals. Right? Because the idea of treating all your kids the same, to me, is ridiculous. My kids are different people. I have to, yeah, exactly. You can't do it. They have different personalities. They have different likes and dislikes. They have different, but they can all have the same rules. They can all follow the same rules. They can all follow the same pathway when it comes to moral guidance, when it comes to principles. They all were taught the same level and the same, but I interact with them differently. Running a company is no different.
Right.
To me, like you have to, all your employees have to have all the same rules, but that doesn't mean you can't interact with them on their level, in their space, at their time, whatever, however you want to word it. But I think that's something that's, you can't teach that in a corporate environment like that. It's not that simple. If you don't grow up with it or have it in your own home, meaning like, okay, so you're one of five or six siblings, or you grow up to have 5 or 6 kids. If we maintain this 1 or 2 per, like right now, we're down to like, I think when I was a kid, we were like, I think it was something like 2.8 children per household. So basically everybody was basically having 3 kids, which is okay. The generation before us was having 4 or more. The generation before them, like to your point, Hurston was one of what, 12, I think you said, or something like that.
My grandma was one of 12, but Hurston, I mean, like her,
So we went from 12 kids to like 5 kids to 3. Now there are plenty of families out there that don't have kids at all. They're just like, oh, we don't want kids. We're done with this. So how do you take those people that have 1 kid or no kid, even 2 kids, I think is not enough, because how do you expect them to be good leaders of a 100-person company, 500-person company, and be able to, I find it difficult. I find that's where some of our difficulty is.
3 kids is I tell this to everybody. 3 kids. 3 kids is the minimum, not max, minimum. You need 3. And I know your career and the Kansas City Chiefs kicker and I don't care. Like anyway, I was talking. Yeah. I'm not going to go too deep into this.
No, I won't.
And he was at a Catholic college. What do you think he was going to say? Why is everyone surprised? Stop it. Fake outrage. Get out of town. Again, critical thinking, context, environment. Like, come on.
Yeah. You didn't see anybody from that commencement, by the way, get up and walk out either.
No. They may have all had a problem, or some of them may have had a problem, but their butt stayed right there.
Right.
They weren't going nowhere.
Right, let's move on.
Let's move on. But I've even told my kids this: 3 is the minimum. If you can, 3 is the minimum. Because guess what? If you have 1 kid, that kid isn't going to learn anything about competition. And that kid isn't going to learn anything about having to do deals or do negotiation. They're just not. They're going to grow up being doted on. And yes, even a highly conscientious parent who tries not to do that with their kid, with 1 child where all your energy is going towards that 1 child, we just know what human beings are.
Not just your energy, the grandparent energy, the aunt, uncle energy,
all of it. The other parent energy, all of it going to that 1 kid. You dump all your resources into that 1 kid, emotional, psychological, financial, all of that 1 kid. And we've seen the outcomes of 1 parent, not 1 parent, but 1 child families. Not great. Those kids tend to knock about really, really ridiculously hard, usually starting in college when people start pushing against them going, oh, well, that's interesting, but this isn't how it works out here. Okay.
Yeah.
2 kids will split you down the middle. And what will wind up happening is 1 kid will be favored, 1 kid will not be favored, or will feel as if they are not favored. And there's no ameliorating, to use a word my grandma would have used, ameliorating middle. There's no middle ground there. Plus, they could split the parents. The mom's going to favor 1, dad's going to favor 1. If there happens to be a divorce, now they're doing manipulations with it's all kinds of different things. But with 3 kids, here's what happens with 3. That kid in the middle ain't putting up with any shenanigans. that kid in the middle, and I know because I was a middle kid. That kid in the middle ain't going to put up with any nonsense. That kid in the middle is going to my point about Hurston, punch both left and right. Clowns and jokers. That kid in the middle is going to keep the older kid level, but also encourage that older kid to be a leader. They're also going to domineer. They're going to domineer that younger kid. They are, to the best of their ability. And by the way, with that younger kid then learns that they can use mom and dad to kind of leverage that middle kid. Oh, forget it. Like, it's game on at that point. Now we know we got some game on things, and you have 5 kids. You watch this happen. I have 4 kids. I've watched this. You know what we know what we're talking about here. But that third kid, that middle kid is critical. And by the way, when you look at the research around where children go in birth order, most middle kids, that's where your entrepreneurship comes from. That's where your disruptors come from. Do you know where your CEO class comes from? The older kids, the first kid. Do you know where most of your worker class comes from? In general, it's younger kids or middle kids who couldn't make it, who couldn't figure out how to like sort of navigate that. 3 kids is the minimum. That's the breakdown. Now, if you go past that, Now you're into the wild. I was one of 4 kids. Please, we created alliances. We did all kinds of shenanigans. It was ridiculous because now you've gone beyond the 3. Now you're into 4. You saw this with your kids with 5. I mean, now the challenge there with parents, particularly younger parents, I think, is that they sometimes feel surrounded with more kids. But you know what? As long as you've established who's El Presidente, and you know that whenever the Marxist revolution comes, they usually come for El Presidente, you'll stay on your toes.
For sure. From a parenting perspective, this is actually simple for me. I don't know anybody, if anybody knows football, I'll tell you, I played for a very long time. I played at a pretty high level. I played semi-pro for 10 years. And I pull a lot of my life back into football. Like football is a lot. I tell everybody that I learned everything I needed to know about life by playing football.
There you go.
Anyway, if you're a parent, you are playing defense. You're defense, okay? When you have one kid, this is simple. You have double coverage. It's like 2 defensive backs covering 1 wide receiver. Easy. Right. That guy's never catching a ball. Let's put it that way, right? Second kid comes, now you're playing man-to-man. You got 1, I got 1. After 3 kids, it doesn't matter because you're playing zone defense no matter what.
Zone all the time.
I got this half the room, you got that half the room. Whatever kid falls into that zone is your responsibility. Deal with it.
Let me tell you something. The hardest thing is as your children leave the house, this is happening to me and my wife right now, as your children leave the house and get to migrate out, when you have to go from playing zone for years to now playing double coverage. That's the hardest thing. Like you would think it would be easy, but it's actually not. Like the spaces in between, you're like, oh.
So I would put that more in like a Tampa 2, where you got one parent that passes off to the other. Like it's double coverage, but it's still like it's a different form of double coverage.
There you go.
But anyway, but I also think the role, like this thing flips too, right? So now all of my kids are basically out. Like I have one kid at home, but I mean he's a full blown adult. I don't have to worry about him. But so essentially, and he kind of comes and goes as he pleases. He's essentially lives on his own, just in my house. Mm-hmm. So I look at it differently. Now I'm on offense. I don't have to worry about defense anymore. I don't have to protect you anymore. I don't have to cover you anymore. Now I get to play offense. So now I'm like, oh, I want to come take the grandkids and spoil the crap out of them. And good luck to you when I bring them home, because that's I don't have to worry about
I'm receiving the child and then I'm passing the child back to you. Look at that.
That's right.
I have been saying for a few years now. Well, not a few years. Really started saying it this year. I'll probably say it more as I get more gray hairs. That's coming. But like the lack of pressure of being a grandparent, I don't think I'm ready for that. I'll be honest. I don't really think I'm ready. I don't think I'm ready for that lack of pressure.
I'm ready. I'm ready right now.
I'm still in. And by the way, I'm speaking as a person who has like a 7-year-old. I'm going to be in the pressure cooker for. Please give me a break.
You've got another 10. You get another 10.
Another 10 years. I got 10 years in the pressure cooker. But I realize how fast 12 years goes, and I'm like, well, at a certain point, there won't be. Wow, what am I going to do then? Like that's going to be insane. I'm like,
somebody asked me once if I was worried about empty nest syndrome, and I went, empty what?
Right. Yeah.
I don't even notice that they're gone at this point. I have so much going on. Like I'm just happy. I was happy when they hit like mid to late teens and I didn't have to like have my thumb on them all the time. I was all right, good. Now I know I have a relative idea where you are. That's enough.
That's enough. That's enough. One other point about this that I wanted to bring up, and then actually we are gonna have to do a 2-parter because I've got another appointment today. Look at that. We are gonna have to do a 2-parter. Oh, that's okay. We'll come back. We'll finish out. Their Eyes Are Watching God is so good. We're at the right of the midpoint of the book anyway, so we'll finish out the book.
Perfect. Yeah.
So when I was a kid, because of how I talk, I was often accused by other kids of talking white. And this is a phenomenon. And by the way, Hurston mentions this in her book, like out of one of her characters' mouths, and not just once, but several times, putting on airs, acting white. There's a character in here named Ms. Turner, who is light-skinned, just like Janie is, and goes on a rant about how she doesn't like dark-skinned Black people. and how she wants to separate away from them and tries to get Janie to leave Tea Cake and go, because Tea Cake's dark skinned, her third husband, and get her to go with Ms. Turner's brother, who is light skinned and has straighter hair. This is a dynamic in the Black community that, again, very rarely gets talked about. Or maybe I wouldn't say very rarely, in the past was rarely talked about, and now is probably talked about more, as Black Americans and African Americans become just Americans. I think we're well down the road to migrating towards that, whether we like it or not. But that phenomenon happened in my lifetime, and to me in my life, where because of the way I talk, and not just myself, my siblings as well, because we were all raised underneath the same gentle regime of language by my grandma, I didn't drop my R's. I didn't engage in code switching easily. I did a lot more when I was in my 20s because I actually understood what the deal was at a conscious level. But as a teenager, and particularly as a young kid, this is how I'm living my life, right? And I would get a lot of flack from other people. Matter of fact, I'm writing about a particular incident that occurred with my mother, where she was accused. She disciplined us in public, and she was accused by another woman who was also African American of raising her kids to be white, and my mother had an unpredictable reaction to that. Let's just say that.
Was it really unpredictable?
Well, not from my perspective. No, I kind of knew which way the wind was blowing, but that lady didn't. It was unpredictable for her.
Okay. I get that.
There were multiple viewpoints on this particular incident that I remember, and this had to have happened when I was maybe about 7 or 8. So things were well boiled in by that point. But I've often been accused of talking white. And I've often by other Black people, never by other white people, never. But by other Black people, accused of going above my airings, being too smart, overthinking things, talking white, acting white. That was a big one when I was a kid and a teenager. And Hurston touches on a lot of this because it is a dynamic that runs through African American culture. And we see it in rap culture publicly. We also see it in hip hop culture. But it's this idea that it's somehow to be racially authentic, which I've never understood what that means. But in order to be racially authentic, you have to conform to certain modes of language and behavior, which again, don't necessarily imply competency or intellectual capacity. And for me, I've always prioritized competency and intellectual capacity rather than conforming. And this is probably why Hurston and I would hang out, rather than conforming to some arbitrary BS meter that, quite frankly, at the end of the day, none of the people who ever accused me of acting or talking or speaking or thinking white, not one of those people would I recognize on the street now if I could throw a stick at them. I wouldn't. They faded into the background. I don't know what they're doing, but I'm going to bet that I put my resume against their resume, and I'm going to win the Pepsi challenge on that. That's a dynamic that, again, never really gets talked about in contemporary culture because it's so challenging to how we think about race. Yeah. It's so challenging to how we think about class too.
Well, I first of all, I agree with you. I think it's really sad that we're having a conversation like this about, your own race and culture is saying that you're not Black enough.
Right. That's precisely right. I just, and it's happened, by the way, it's happened less and less as I've gotten older and older.
Sure.
Because,
because you then select who you're hanging around. It's not correct. So much. Yeah. So I agree. Because in school, again, the comment I made earlier about bringing, to my grandmother saying, they were, we have a similar scenario in the Native community, Hassan. Yeah. So I've heard that about the Black community in the past. I've had several Black friends that have said similar things. So it's not surprising to me that you would say something like that. But in the Native community, it's not really talked about all that much. And in the Native community, when you're not Native enough, the difference is in the Native community, they say you're not Native enough and they can prove it because you I carry a card that says that says I'm Native and you don't. So you're not as Native as I am because I have a card and you don't. And who issues the card is the U.S. government through tribal governments. But like the tribal government, they want you to think that the tribal governments are the ones that, yes, I will say the tribal government's the one that hands the card over to you. They're the ones that give you the card. But the U.S. federal government kind of dictates that what we do with these cards and how we do this and what the rules are. And there's a lot of BS that comes around with this. So, and I'll just say it right here for the record. I am eligible to have a card. I refuse to own one because I'm not going to allow anybody to tell me who I am and who I'm not, and whether I am or am not Native enough, or whether I am or not whatever. I refuse to allow the federal government to dictate any of that to me. So, but that stuff happens in our community as well. And again, like I said, it's a little bit more literal, right? Meaning like in what you described, if you surrounded yourself around 25 of your Black friends that spoke the same way you did, act the same way you did, and another Black person came in and said, you know, none of you are really Black, and the rest of you are like, go fry. Like, who cares? You can't say that. What are you using as a barometer here? Are you using yourself as a barometer? Because quite honestly, we don't really care about your opinion. In the Native community, it's like, you're not Native enough. Oh yeah, well yeah, I can prove it. I have one of these cards and you don't. So go fry. Like, right. And they could be talking about. I use 25 in your example. In our community, there could be 10 of you, 25. There could be 2,500 of you, and they don't care because they still say the card wins over the 2,500 of you. It's very weird for me. It's very weird.
That is insane. That is not nearly. That is equally as insane as what I have described.
For sure.
And the fact that Hurston saw that insanity and was able to put it in an anthropological and ethnographic framework, and then actually write about it in an emotive way. Yeah. That rings down through time 70, 80 years to me. That's brilliant. That's art. Yeah. That's art. And
I'm not even, I am not kidding. I wish you were alive today. I would love to have met this person. I really would have.
She was a genius. Yeah. And she also, and I'm going to close on this, she also had principle. And the same principle that Tom talks about not getting a card, the same principle that I have about, and for me, it's a metaphorical and an emotional and a philosophical rejection of the position. I just reject your position. I don't accept your premise. And by the way, you don't even want to talk about what your premise is underneath. You just want to make your statement and tag me and then put me in a box and then move on. No, I don't accept the premise. That is what principle walk down actually looks like. And it's the principle of, and it's the same principle that Hurston had in her own life. It's the principle of the individual over the group, the individual over the collective. You need to get to know me as an individual, just like I need to get to know you as an individual before we can bring individuals together and successfully lead them towards anything. And if we don't do that hard work, then we fall into biases and prejudices that are even more pernicious and endemic and continue to lead to problems that I think we are doing our human best anyway to actually try to solve. I'd like to thank Tom for coming on the podcast today. We're going to do a part 2 of this. We're going to come back and revisit this because we only got through half of the book. So this is part 1.
I think I would enjoy that actually. Yeah.
Well, you're going to be back for part 2. So like, I mean, I don't know where you think you're going. So I'm not doing this without you. Come on, give me a break. We're already halfway down the road, sir.
You have a lot of other very well-educated co-hosts that I wasn't sure if that would fall under.
I do, but
a different kind of version of it. Hey, I'm just saying, I'm happy to do it. I'm very excited about it.
Not only are you happy, you are doing it. You've already been tagged and bagged. You're already in the car. So it's too late.
Okay. All right.
The Blues Brothers are going down the street. And so with that, I'd like to thank Tom Libby for coming on the first half of our podcast today. Their Eyes Were Watching God was Zora Neale Hurston, part 1, ending right here. And well, We're out. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.